I was still having trouble understanding the power of everything I was feeling, the way it had completely taken over everything else. I smiled at her as she agreed. Very different. More forceful than I'd imagined. Although she'd made it fairly clear she'd never really been in a relationship before, it was nice just the same, hearing her say it. At least we were both figuring this all out together. For example, I continued, deciding it was time to admit my irrational jealousy. With all her insecurities, it seemed only fair to let her know she definitely wasn't alone in that either. The emotion of jealousy. I've read about it 100,000 times, seen actors portray it in 1,000 different plays and movies. I believed I understood that one pretty clearly. But it shocked me. For a split second I almost lost my nerve, thinking about how humiliating it was going to be to admit everything out loud. Still, I knew it would make her happy. 57. Do you remember the day that Mike asked you to the dance? She nodded and a rather adorable smile tugged at her cheek. The day you started talking to me again, I sighed. At least her smile had just given me something to replace the bad feelings surrounding that day. I was surprised by the flare of resentment, almost fury, that I felt. I didn't recognize what it was at first. I was even more aggravated than usual that I couldn't know what you were thinking, why you refused him. Was it simply for your friend's sake? I hated using the word friend in reference to Jessica and her cruel mind. Was there someone else? I knew I had no right to care either way. I tried not to care. Her expression was shocked, like she truly had no idea what I was talking about, why it had bothered me so much. So I laughed and added. And then the line started forming. She did not look amused. Even now, so long after the fact, all the attention still bothered her. I should count myself grateful that my relentless pursuit seemed to be the one she didn't mind. I waited, unreasonably anxious to hear what you would say to them, to watch your expressions. I couldn't deny the relief I felt, watching the annoyance on your face. But I couldn't be sure. I took a deep breath and prepared to admit just how long I'd been watching her sleep. I had no way of knowing whether it would upset her more, knowing it had been for such a long time. I hoped we'd come far enough, and she would appreciate my honesty enough that she would let it go. That was the first night I came here. I wrestled all night, while watching you sleep, with the chasm between what I knew was right, moral, ethical, and what I wanted. I knew that if I continued to ignore you as I should, or if I left for a few years, till you were gone, that someday you would say yes to Mike, or someone like him. It made me angry. She was watching me with unfathomable eyes, disbelief apparent on her face, like she couldn't understand my strong reaction. I wondered what she would think if she knew how many times I'd fantasized about shoving Mike into a wall, or even simply threatening him, demanding that he stay away from Bella. Irrational, yes. Tempting, absolutely. And then, I said, hoping my disclosing the details of her sleep talking wouldn't incite the same reaction as earlier. As you were sleeping, you said my name. I closed my eyes for a moment, remembering how that was the moment I'd first realized I loved her. It had awoken the man in me, the part of me that wanted to be everything for her. You spoke so clearly. At first I thought you'd woken. But you rolled over restlessly and mumbled my name once more, and sighed. The feeling that coursed through me then was unnerving, staggering. And I knew I couldn't ignore you any longer. Her face was still frozen in shock, but I heard her heart start beating erratically. I hoped she was finally starting to understand why I watched her every night, why I became addicted to it. Still so cautious around me in her everyday life, it was the only way for me to know how she really felt. It gave me hope. It gave me strength to keep fighting the battle everyone was so convinced I was going to lose. I wished she would say something, anything to let me into her mind for just a moment. I was kind of pouring my heart out and she was sitting there like a statue before me. Then I thought of something I was fairly sure would get a reaction from her. 58. But jealousy.it's a strange thing. So much more powerful than I would have thought. And irrational. Just now, when Charlie asked you about that vile Mike Newton, I said, shaking my head and waiting for her response. I should have known you'd be listening. She said, more defeated than I thought necessary. Of course I listened. I thought she knew that by now. Of course. I said simply. That made you feel jealous, though, really. I smiled. There it was. Of all her admirers, she seemed the most irritated by Mike. Much to my great amusement. I'm new at this. You're resurrecting the human in me, and everything feels stronger because it's fresh. But honestly, for that to bother you, after I have to hear that Rosalie, the incarnation of pure beauty. Rosalie was meant for you. Emmett or no Emmett, how can I compete with that? Of all the ridiculous, absolutely pointless things for her to worry about, she was really jealous of Rosalie. I might have said something, but it occurred to me that my jealousy of that pathetic, childish Mike probably looked just as absurd to her. There's no competition, I assured her, smiling my biggest, brightest smile. When even that seemed to do nothing to make her feel better. I took both her hands still locked firmly in my grasp, and brought them around behind me. It felt spectacular having her whole body pressed against mine, and I allowed myself another deep breath of her hair. I know there's no competition. That's the problem, she said sadly. I hated hearing her sound that way, so broken, so insignificant. How did she not yet know she was everything to me? Of course Rosalie is beautiful in her way, but even if she wasn't like a sister to me, even if Emmett didn't belong with her, she could never have 1/10. No 1/100th of the attraction you hold for me. I paused to make sure she was really listening to me. I needed her to understand, to believe me when I told her she was the only person in all my years who'd made me glad I existed. I'd spent so long feeling like everything was pointless. Not even trying to find a partner because what good could it possibly do? All those years of loneliness, of trying to make peace with my solitude, were worth it because they had led me to her. For almost 90 years I've walked among my kind, and yours. All the time thinking I was complete in myself. Not realizing what I was seeking. And not finding anything, because you weren't alive yet. I finally felt her smile into my chest as she pressed her cheek closer to me. It hardly seems fair, she said softly. I haven't had to wait at all. Why should I get off so easily? I rolled my eyes at her. Only Bella could classify spending so much time alone with a vampire as easy. You're right. I teased, trying to make her see her inane logic. I should make this harder for you, definitely. Then I scooped both of her hands up into one of mine, so that I could run my fingers through her silky hair. 59. You only have to risk your life every second you spend with me. That's surely not much. You only have to turn your back on nature, on humanity. What's that worth? Very little. I don't feel deprived of anything. She spoke with such sincerity it made my chest tighten, like I was gasping for air I didn't need. She really didn't feel like she was giving anything up to be with me. But what about when she wanted more? We could never be together the way a man and a woman should be. We could never have a family together, or even grow old together. How long could she stay happy, growing older while watching me stay frozen in time? Not yet. I finally sighed, willing myself not to think about all the things I was taking away from her by staying. I wasn't ready for that yet. For now I just wanted to stay in our perfect moment, her arms around me, my face buried in her hair. Breaking from my thoughts. I heard footsteps outside her door. Charlie was checking up on her. Just like she'd anticipated. My grip instinctively tightened around her. What? She asked, but he was already slowly turning the doorknob. It was rather inconvenient not being able to hear his thoughts clearly. Still, I felt like I should have heard him coming sooner. I let go of her hands and slipped out of her arms quickly, stifling a chuckle when she almost fell face first onto the bed where I had just been. Lie down, I whispered, and watch her curl quickly into a ball under the blanket. Her forced breathing was laughable, and I was glad the room was too dark for Charlie to really notice anything strange. He watched her for a moment and I heard his staggered thoughts berate himself for having been suspicious. I almost felt bad for him, because he'd actually been pretty spot on. After about a minute, he softly closed the door again. When I heard him close his own bedroom door, I silently slipped under the covers and wrapped my arm around Bella. It was warm under her thick quilt, which made me feel less guilty about pressing my cold body so close to hers. I leaned over her and whispered into her ear. You are a terrible actress. I'd say that career path is out for you, darn it. She said, feigning nonchalance again. But I could hear her wildly beating heart. Hear it, and revel in it. As much as I wished she could stay awake all night with me. I didn't want sleep deprivation to add to her usual lack of balance. Someone would probably notice if I flew out in front of her to catch her if she started to fall. Reluctantly, I started humming to her, trying to slow her frantic heart. It was nice to finally be able to sing Bella her lullaby, even if I wasn't quite ready to tell her I'd written it for her. "Should I sing you to sleep?" I asked softly, listening as her heartbeat and breathing steadied. "Right," she said with a laugh. "Like I could sleep with you here," still self-conscious. I wished she could see there was nothing for her to be embarrassed of. "You do it all the time," I said softly. "But I didn't know you were here," she replied, the earlier irritation starting to creep back into her voice. I knew it was selfish, but I was afraid she was going to ask me to leave, so I hastily changed the subject. "So if you don't want to sleep," I trailed off. I think she read more into my tone than I was intending because I heard her inhale sharply. "If I don't want to sleep," she repeated. 60. "What do you want to do then?" I asked with a laugh, hoping I hadn't just put an idea into her head that really shouldn't be there. I listened while she returned her breathing to normal. "I'm not sure," she muttered after almost a minute. "Tell me when you decide," I said, more than happy to fill my time enjoying her skin and her scent. I traced my nose along the length of her jaw, breathing in and letting my breath wash over her. I felt goosebumps rise on her neck. It was really quite amazing. Now that I'd gotten past the worst of the pain, I found that I could really take all of her in, enjoy the aroma that was unique to her. It reminded me just how precious a gift I'd been given. "I thought you were desensitized. Just because I'm resisting the wine doesn't mean I can't appreciate the bouquet," I told her gently, hoping it wouldn't upset her. It was a compliment, really, though I wasn't entirely sure she could see it that way. "You have a very floral smell, like lavender, or freesia. It's mouthwatering, yeah. It's an off day when I don't get somebody telling me how edible I smell," she said sarcastically. I laughed at her flippant reaction. Okay, so maybe she hadn't accepted the compliment, but at least I hadn't offended her. "I've decided what I want to do," she finally said. "I want to hear more about you." I wondered how much more she really wanted to know. I felt like I'd already told her most of my deepest, darkest secrets. And now she knew all about my family, and how I'd been created. What else was there? "Ask me anything," I replied, curious. "Why do you do it?" she asked after a moment. "I still don't understand how you can work so hard to resist what you are. Please don't misunderstand, of course I'm glad that you do. I just don't see why you would bother in the first place." I'll admit, it wasn't a question I'd expected her to ask. Mostly because it meant she was actually thinking about what it traditionally meant to be a vampire. I'd been assuming she avoided thinking about the logistics of it all, and here she was blatantly asking why I wasn't off killing people like the rest of them. "That's a good question," I finally said, not wanting her to think I was avoiding answering. "And you are not the first one to ask it. The others, the majority of our kind who are quite content with our lot, they, too, wonder at how we live. But you see, just because we've been dealt a certain hand, it doesn't mean that we can't choose to rise above to conquer the boundaries of a destiny that none of us wanted. To try to retain whatever essential humanity we can." She didn't say anything for a while, and her breathing didn't change. I hoped I was explaining it well enough for her, because it was a very important part of our lives. Clinging to whatever shreds of humanity we could was what kept us going, gave us the courage to fight against our nature. It was essentially the reason I was able to lay here, tangled up with a human whose blood called to me, begged me to give in, yet all I wanted was to hold and protect her. After several more moments of silence, I had to ask, "Did you fall asleep?" It had been a very long, emotionally draining day. "No," she said, though her voice betrayed her obvious exhaustion. "Is that all you were curious about?" 61. "Not quite. Of course not. Not the always inquisitive Bella. What else do you want to know? Why can you read minds? Why only you? And Alice, seeing the future. Why does that happen?" I shrugged, having often wondered that myself. "We don't really know," I told her truthfully. "Carlyle has a theory. He believes that we all bring something of our strongest human traits with us into the next life, where they are intensified like our minds, and our senses. He thinks that I must have already been very sensitive to the thoughts of those around me. And that Alice had some precognition, wherever she was. What did he bring into the next life, and the others?" she asked, excitedly. Again I found myself slightly concerned by her obvious fascination with us. It was just so far from the normal human reaction to the supernatural. Carlyle brought his compassion. Esme brought her ability to love passionately. Emmett brought his strength. Rosalie, her tenacity, I said through clenched teeth. There were a lot of other words for it, but I was in the presence of a lady. Or you could call it pigheadedness. I laughed, unable to resist. Jasper is very interesting. I continued, not quite sure how to explain it. It was more something you needed to experience. He was quite charismatic in his first life, able to influence those around him to see things his way. Now he is able to manipulate the emotions of those around him, calm down a room of angry people, for example, or excite a lethargic crowd, conversely. It's a very subtle gift. Subtle, and very useful. It was a lot of information to take in, so I calmly stroked her hair, her cheek, her arm, while I waited for another question. Part of me hoped she would fall asleep in the process. I was so anxious to hear her dream. So where did it all start? She finally said groggily. I mean, Carlyle changed you, and then someone must have changed him, and so on. It was like our own twisted version of the chicken and the egg. Where did it all start? There had to be a beginning for us, just like there was a beginning for mankind. Although I'd never really been able to make sense of it myself. I tried to explain my take on it as best I could. Well, where did you come from? Evolution. Creation. Couldn't we have evolved in the same way as other species, predator and prey? Or, if you don't believe that all this world could have just happened on its own, which is hard for me to accept myself, is it so hard to believe that the same force that created the delicate angelfish with the shark, the baby seal and the killer whale, could create both our kinds together? Let me get this straight, I'm the baby seal, right? She said slyly, peeking for one brief second over her shoulder at me. I grinned. Glad she made the connection. Right, I laughed, burying my face further into her glorious hair. There was another moment of peaceful quiet, so I softly asked. Are you ready to sleep? Or do you have any more questions? Only 1,000,000 or 2, I sighed. We have tomorrow. I reminded her. And the next day, and the next. I could feel her smile in the darkness. Are you sure you won't vanish in the morning? You are mythical, after all. 62. Her voice was teasing, but I knew it was something she was genuinely worried about. I wanted to make the point very clear. I was hers, absolutely and unconditionally. I wasn't going anywhere unless she ordered me away. I won't leave you, I said solemnly. She seemed to take that in for a moment, then added. One more, then, tonight. I waited for her question, but it didn't come. Instead, I felt her skin grow hot under mine. It was like her whole body was blushing, and I wondered what question could have created such a strong reaction. What is it? I asked, the curiosity almost unbearable. No, forget it. I changed my mind, Bella, you can ask me anything. I urged. I knew I wouldn't be able to relax and enjoy our night together if I was left wondering what she was too afraid to know. I thought I'd already told her the worst, but who knows? Her reactions were never what I expected. My fingers started playing aimlessly with her hair until finally I let out a frustrated moan. I keep thinking it will get less frustrating. Not hearing your thoughts. But it just gets worse and worse. It didn't seem right. She was going to get a peaceful night's rest and I was going to lay there agonizing all night over what piece of information she was too afraid to know. I'm glad you can't read my thoughts. It's bad enough that you eavesdrop on my sleep talking, she said. Trying to change the subject. Please, I begged, but she shook her head. If you don't tell me, I'll just assume it's something much worse than it is. I was already imaging the worst. Maybe she'd ask me what human blood tastes like. That was the last thing I wanted to think about with her lying in my arms, all trusting and delectable. Please, I pleaded one last time. Well, she said, and I breathed a sigh of relief. Yes, I didn't think it was possible, but her skin suddenly seemed to radiate even more heat. You said that Rosalie and Emmett will get married soon. She whispered. Is that marriage the same as it is for humans? Is that what you're getting at? I laughed, relieved that was all it was. She wanted to know if vampires had the same physical desires as humans. It wasn't something I would have expected her to think of, but all things considered, it didn't seem too difficult a topic. It had a pretty straightforward answer. Yes. I suppose it is much the same. I told you most of those human desires are there. Just hidden behind more powerful desires. Oh, she mumbled. Only I got the feeling there was more. And with a sudden twinge of anxiety, it occurred to me the next part of her question might not be as easily answered. Glutton for punishment that I was. I had to ask. Was there a purpose behind your curiosity? Well, I did wonder, about you and me. Someday, great. Why hadn't I just sung her to sleep earlier like I'd wanted to? I'm sure it would have worked. She was so exhausted, and she seemed to relax so easily when I ran my fingers along. 63, her skin. But I wanted to hear her voice more, to know what she was thinking. Stupid curious vampire. I supposed it wasn't an option to just jump out the window. I realized after a moment that her body had gone as still as mine. It was too much to hope for that she had fallen asleep. I assumed she was holding her breath, anxiously waiting for me to answer the question I really wanted to avoid. I don't think that would be possible for us. I finally said, utterly defeated. Because it would be too hard for you, if I were that close. Oh. Bella, you had to say it. Didn't you? I'd been trying to answer her very pragmatically, speaking from a purely logistical, theoretical standpoint. Now I was thinking about her, wondering what it would be like, wishing it were possible. Didn't she know she was driving me crazy, too? That's certainly a problem. I admitted, trying to force my mind away from the image that had instantly filled my every thought. But that's not what I was thinking of. At least it hadn't been. It's just that you are so soft, so fragile. I have to mind my actions every moment that we're together so that I don't hurt you. I could kill you quite easily. Bella, simply by accident, I was whispering, feeling somewhat ashamed to admit yet another weakness. I was so afraid I wouldn't be able to control my actions if I let myself lose focus with her. Every touch, every caress was so carefully calculated. I very lightly touched my palm to her cheek and felt her press just slightly into it. That also complicated things. She didn't seem to be minding her own actions very closely, and there was just no way for me to know how she was going to respond in any given situation. If I was too hasty, if for 1 second I wasn't paying enough attention. I could reach out, meaning to touch your face, and crush your skull by mistake. You don't realize how incredibly breakable you are. I can never afford to lose any kind of control when I'm with you. I wanted her to say something, anything, to assure me that this wasn't a deal breaker. I'd assumed she'd realized my strength after what happened in the meadow today, but maybe she hadn't really thought it through. Maybe she had been lying there, wondering why I didn't hold her more tightly. Maybe my soft caresses wouldn't be enough for her. Are you scared? I finally asked, bracing myself for whatever her response would be. She seemed to think about it for a few moments, but when she spoke, her voice was steady. No, I'm fine. I listened to her heart, her breathing, and deliberated for a minute or two. She seemed content, but she had stopped trying to pull me in closer. In an attempt to reassure her, I squeezed her just a little bit tighter and felt her sigh. Relieved that we'd made it through yet another difficult conversation, something else popped into my head. I didn't really have a right to ask, but with all we'd already been through, I figured she could handle it. I tried to make my voice as light and unconcerned as possible. I'm curious now, though. Have you ever? Oddly enough, I realized I was just as embarrassed speaking bluntly about it as she had been. Of course not, she answered quickly, the heat returning to her skin. I told you I've never felt like this about anyone before. Not even close, I know. It's just that I know other people's thoughts. I know love and lust don't always keep the same company. 64. They do for me. Now, anyway, that they exist for me at all. I smiled at her in the darkness and nuzzled further into her hair. I thought about how I'd watched the rest of my family find their mates, the bonds they had formed perfect and unbreakable. It made it that much stranger to watch so many humans change partners as often as they changed clothes. I didn't think Bella fell into that category, thinking of how irritated she'd been when males showed her attention, but I didn't know what her life had been back in Phoenix. It was a relief to hear her say it. That obnoxious feeling of jealousy had already started to gnaw at me again, just thinking about her with someone else, even if it was before I knew her. That's nice. I sighed. We have one thing in common, at least, your human instincts. She said, her voice low and shaky again. Well, do you find me attractive in that way at all? I laughed and resumed playing with her hair. Silly, insecure, beautiful girl. Couldn't she feel it? Couldn't she tell all the ways I wanted her? I may not be human, but I am a man. I told her, hoping she would just leave it at that. Thankfully, she finally gave in to a huge yawn. I've answered your questions. Now you should sleep, I said, really needing us to be finished for the night. I couldn't remember what it felt like to be tired, but I'm pretty sure this was the closest I'd ever come to it. I'm not sure if I can. She was still nervous having me there, and I knew she needed sleep. Reluctantly I asked, "Do you want me to leave?" "No," she yelled, and I laughed. She was going to wake up Charlie, and then where would we be? I lowered my lips once again to her ear and began humming her lullaby. It was only a few moments before I felt her go limp in my arms, her breathing relaxed and steady. Finally able to relax myself, I let my thoughts drift while idly tracing my fingers across her shoulders, her back. Occasionally she let out a soft sigh, so I knew she was enjoying my touch, even in her sleep. It was a miraculous feeling. I had no way of knowing if she'd even be able to dream with me there. Bella was so strong-willed, maybe she'd talk her subconscious out of it for fear of what I might hear her say. Still, even if she was silent all night, none of my nights listening to her could compare to the feeling of her sleeping in my arms. Knowing she trusted me so completely filled me with an entirely new kind of joy. I may not be able to be everything for her, but I could always be her protector, her shelter. After a while, she started to stir. I hoped she wasn't getting cold, so I wrapped the quilt more tightly around her, trying to block out the chill of my body. She made a low murmur, then startled me by flipping completely over and turning into me. She wrapped her arm around my waist and buried her face into my chest. I was frozen, shocked at how tightly she was holding me. Then, it happened. She said my name. Without thinking, I reached up to run my fingers through her hair and she sighed, nuzzling further into my chest. When she said my name again, I responded, hoping that somewhere in her subconscious she could hear me. "I'm here, Bella. I'm here. I've got you," I said softly. 65. My fingers continued their slow rhythm in her hair as I started softly singing to her again. She was so warm, so beautiful. I felt like my silent heart was going to suddenly start beating again. Then, just when I thought the night couldn't get any more perfect, I heard her speak the words I'd been longing to hear. "I love you," she breathed, and I felt my own breath catch. I marveled at her words, then whispered, "I love you, too. Bella. I'm always going to love you." It was the greatest moment of my entire existence. After a few minutes of silence, her breathing changed and I knew the dream was over. She was very still and her grip on me had loosened. Hoping I wouldn't wake her, I brushed the hair away from her face and kissed her lightly on her forehead. I let my lips linger for a few seconds while breathing in all of her exquisite scent. Then I kissed her beautiful closed eyes and told her again how much I loved her. I hoped it would soothe her long enough for me to make a quick run home. I hadn't anticipated her wanting me to stay. As much as it hurt to think about leaving her, even for a few minutes, I thought it would be a good idea to check in with my family. Although I was confident Alice would have assured them things had gone well, I figured I owed it to them to tell them in person. Well, really I was only concerned with telling Carlisle and Esme. The rest of them could think whatever they wanted to think. Either way, changing clothes seemed like a good idea as well. It felt like the respectful thing to do, even though I was pretty sure none of Bella's neighbors had seen me go in with her last night. Still, Bella hated attention, and the last thing she needed was people speculating about me having stayed the night. I smiled to myself, wondering if now I would be spending every night. She seemed rather reluctant to let me go, certain she'd drifted into the dreamless portion of her sleep. I kissed her hair one more time and climbed carefully out of bed. Surprisingly, I felt just a bit colder as soon as our bodies weren't pressed together anymore. Eager to get back to her before she noticed I was gone, I decided to make it a very quick run. I flew soundlessly through the trees, hurrying even for me. When I got home, they were waiting for me, like I knew they'd be. "Where've you been all night?" Emmett thought the second I walked through the door. I eyed him with a look that clearly said, "Everything is fine, but please don't make me go into details." Refusing to let it go, he spoke aloud. "Seriously, man. We've all been worried. What happened today? Yeah, how did your big day with the human go?" Rosalie chimed in sarcastically. "Did you actually manage not to kill her?"